Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk briefly about the various irrigation methods that are used in agriculture. Now, humans use a lot of water in our daily lives. We use it for cooking, for cleaning, for growing our food, in our manufacturing processes. But if we take a step back and look at how is freshwater used overall, we see that about 70% of the world's freshwater is actually used in agriculture. So it's used to grow our food, which is kind of great because we need to eat. But the problem is that the amount of freshwater that's being used total is significantly increasing. So as you can see in this graph, our global freshwater use has steadily increased over the last 50 years or so. Now still, we've kept this relatively same proportions, with about 70% of the water being used for agriculture, about 20% of water being used in industry and manufacturing, and only about 10% of global water use being used in households. Now if you're thinking, how can I make the world a more sustainable place? Where can we make some cuts to this water usage? It might make sense that, turning the water off in between brushing your teeth might feel like a very small impact. However, collectively, this can make a pretty big impact. We also need to think about how is our food grown and how can we manage those resources a little bit better to maybe reduce some of that overall total water usage. Now, when we think about the ways that agriculture uses water, the primary use is in irrigation. Now we're going to talk about 4 different types of irrigation. We have drip irrigation, flood irrigation, furrow irrigation, and spray irrigation. Those are our 4. We'll start here with drip irrigation. This involves long hoses or tubes that have small little holes in them. And these tubes are run along the ground directly along the base of the plants. Now this is super efficient because the water is being delivered directly to the plant, directly where it needs it. However, this is also incredibly expensive because it takes a lot of money and a lot of man hours to lay that tubing out exactly where you need it. So this is something that's only really practical in smaller scale agricultural settings. You're not going to see a whole cornfield lined with drip irrigation. It just doesn't make economic sense. The second type of irrigation is called flood irrigation. Now this is not seen in the United States very frequently. However, we find it more often in Asian countries. Now this involves flooding the entire field with water and then draining that water and moving it to the next field. So we're just kind of shifting this large body of water around to keep the soil saturated. Now, the problem is that about 20% of the water that's used in flood irrigation is lost to evaporation and runoff, which makes sense because it's not a very efficient means. But there are other downsides, including waterlogging of the soil, which we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. The third type of irrigation is called furrow irrigation. Now a furrow is a small little channel or ditch in between the rows of the crops. So what happens with furrow irrigation is very similar to flood irrigation. However, instead of flooding the entire field, you are just directing that water to travel down those furrows between the crop rows. Now, relatively, this is not very expensive. However, we lose about 1/3 of the water, again, to evaporation and runoff. The fourth type of irrigation is called spray irrigation, and this is what you might be most familiar with seeing in the United States. So what spray irrigation involves is pumping groundwater up and distributing it through a series of spray nozzles, and particularly like a center pivot irrigation. You'll see that center post and it will spray kind of in a circle around the entire field. Now, this is not very efficient again. However, typically only about 1/4 or less of the water is lost to evaporation and runoff. So in the scale of things, not the most efficient, but also not the least efficient. This is also quite a bit more expensive than flood and furrow irrigation, and it requires a significant amount of energy in order to pump the water to be used. Waterlogging is the phenomena that occurs when too much water accumulates in the soil. And this is super saturating that soil and it's raising that water table. And what happens is the plant essentially drowns. And it drowns because the roots of the plant, even though they're underground, they still require oxygen. So if you start to see a little bit of ponding in a particular agricultural field, that means that there's waterlogging taking place in that soil. So farmers can do a variety of tactics to address this, including putting in ditches or tiling to help improve that drainage of the field. And these practices lead to some other consequences that we'll talk about in other videos. Irrigation can also lead to this phenomena called salinization. Now, salinization is talking about salts. So that water that is pumped onto these agricultural fields holds a lot of dissolved substances, some of which are salts. Now, when that water evaporates off of the field or is absorbed through the roots, oftentimes that salt is left behind. And that salt can accumulate within that soil, and eventually that soil can become way too salty to be able to grow any plants. So while that irrigation could be good in the short term, if that water that's being pumped onto the field contains too much salt, that could be very detrimental to the field in the long run. Additionally, irrigation can lead to what's called aquifer depletion. So aquifers are these underground saturated chunks of soil and rock. Now, an aquifer is not this underground lake. That's a common misconception of students. Now, when you have a well, you have this tube going down into the ground, into the soil, until you reach the part of soil that is saturated with water pretty much all the time. That would be your aquifer. And you can pump that water up out of the aquifer onto your field. Now, the problem here is agriculture uses a huge amount of water in irrigation. And the Ogallala Aquifer, which sits under the Central Plains of the United States, is tapped into quite frequently for these large-scale agricultural facilities throughout the Midwestern United States. The problem here is that in these large-scale operations that require a lot of water, and especially when we have drought years, we are pumping water out of that aquifer faster than it can be replenished. So rainfall and this aquifer recharge helps to return water back to that aquifer. But oftentimes in agriculture, we are using that water faster than it's going back in. Now, I do want to point out that not all agricultural operations require irrigation. Many farmers make do without pumping water onto their fields and just relying on Mother Nature to water their crops. So in summary, there are four main types of irrigation. We have drip irrigation, flood irrigation, furrow irrigation, and spray irrigation. You also need to make sure that you know some of these impacts of waterlogging, salinization, and aquifer depletion. Please send me your questions here, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.